This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, welcome. It's the Pocono Liars Club again with me, Michael A. Ventrella, and we are having another one of our wonderful conversations with some professionals in the business. This time we have Lawrence Watt Evans from the West Coast visiting us now, originally from Boston. Lawrence, by the way, in case you're not familiar with him, shame on you, has written over 50 books in all kind of varieties of fantasy, science fiction, mystery, nonfiction,
No,
short
no,
stories.
no. Hold it. No mystery. No mystery.
Oh, wasn't there a science fiction mystery series you did?
Okay, yeah, but it was
That's what I was
marketed
thinking
as science fiction. It was more science fiction than mystery.
of. Okay. Um, you might know him mostly from Misenchanted Sword or Dragon Weather, or the more recent steampunk novels that I've been enjoying is the Tom Derringer series. He won a Hugo Award for Why I Left Harry's All Night Hamburgers story. Actually, let me ask you about that first. I think there I remembered something about the rights to that being bought. Is there any new news you can share with us?
Warner Brothers has the rights to make a movie of it. Um, they last I heard there was a director attached, but no cast, and they were redoing the script. And beyond that, they don't tell me anything. I don't know.
Well, that's wonderful. I hope it comes to play. You know, it's so often with Hollywood, they never get that farther than that, and let's hope we're going to see that soon. Today,
Mhm.
we're going to talk about world building, however, and we'll start by just, well, actually, first, do you have anything you want to say just to say an introduction that I missed that I should have said?
No.
Okay, that's easy. Let's talk about world building because that's our topic for today. Now, let me ask world building, when people think of world building, they sometimes think that it's science fiction and fantasy world building, but it really applies to any kind of story, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, if um, there's, I mean, noir fiction, detective stories, they have their own world that they take place in. I mean, there's mysteries, all mysteries. I mean, Agatha Christie's cozies have very little to do with the real world, you know. Um, and you can't do the entire universe in a novel. There just isn't room. So you have to decide what universe, what world you're playing in for whatever story you want to tell, no matter what genre it is.
Do you
And
start with the story and then worry about the world, or do you like to create a world first and then come up with the story?
I've done it both ways. Okay, no, I was going to say my more successful stuff started with the world, but that isn't always true. With Dragon Weather, I started with the story. With the Misenchanted Sword, I started with the world. So I've done it both ways. I've started with a particular scene that I wanted to write, or you know, I don't know. I started with pretty much anything you can start a story with, a
Um,
character or a plot twist or a setting, anything.
well, let's just try to narrow down what we mean when we're talking about world building. And you mentioned that it sort of works with every single type of story you want to do.
Pretty
And
much.
sometimes the world is just, if it's a small town, how do the people react? What's the gossip? What's the local culture like? Those sort of things. Do you really
Right.
need to create all that for your story, or does it sort of come about as you're writing the story?
Oh, usually, okay. You need to start with a few basics, but most of it happens while you're writing. I mean, in I mentioned Dragon Weather. When I was writing Dragon Weather, I didn't know anything about the lands of man when I started. All I knew was that I was starting off with an isolated village and a dragon, and everything else evolved as the story went along. Um, I knew a reasonable amount of the plot, and there was one a scene near the end of the novel that I knew had to be in there, and that I was writing toward the whole time. And um, but other than that, I did not know anything about the world it was set in until I had started writing and was going along. And okay, what happens next? Where does he go next? Where does he go from here? And I would work out what made sense to me, what fit the world I'd already created, and what would fit the eventual plot. So it's a matter of, but I don't always do it that way. I mean, the Earthshar stories, I started out in ninth grade geometry. Um, we were doing work with a compass, and you would have a piece of paper underneath the piece of paper you were working on so that the point of the compass would not mar the desktop too much. And I had a piece of 8.5 by 14 paper that had a whole bunch of little holes and marks in it from doing the geometry on top of it. And it's like, I don't want to throw this away. So I used the dots as the basis of a map. And once I had that map is where the world of Earthshar came from. And it's still, that original map actually is on my website, or at least part of it is. And that's been what the entire series of 16 books has been built around. The marks from my geometry class.
So when you're creating a fantasy world, we'll talk about that first, and then we'll start talking about some other things, because sometimes I think
Okay.
fantasy worlds are the most fun to create.
Science fiction can be a lot of fun too. But yes,
Well, yeah.
go on.
What are some of the aspects that you think need to be thought of by writers when they're putting one of these things together that they sometimes might forget about? Because a lot of science fiction and fantasy writers, I find, care about maps. They
Yes.
care about, you know, what kind of monsters are in the world, and then they forget all about government or
Food.
economics. You know, like a
They forget
castle
about food.
doesn't have any farms around it, so how do they feed all those
Yeah,
people? Things
I mean,
like that.
you have these cities, a walled city in the middle of a giant forest, and it's like, what are they eating?
Yes.
You know? Um, in yeah, I spent 2019 pretty much the entire year touring Europe with my wife because she had just retired, and you see that you do see castles and walled cities, and they always have plenty of land around them that used to be farmed. It often isn't now, but it was originally, and that was sort of essential, you know. And they had to have water. Frequently, that was a very important thing. I remember the largest castle in Britain is in Wales. I'm blanking on the name right now. It's this huge thing. It's in multiple layers with like 3 layers of moats, let alone the layers of walls. And the biggest thing that they had to deal with was supplying enough water to maintain the people to maintain the site. Um, and they had this elaborate system of pumps and wells and so forth that basically they redirected an entire river through the system of moats with one section of the river going strictly into the storage tanks for the water supply for the castle. You know, and you look at that and it's like, this is not something most fantasy writers would ever bother to work out, but the people actually had to live in this place. They had to work with all this. They also had things like there's an entire island up the other end of the lake that was where their mutton supply was and their wool for making fabric. They had this artificial island that was dead flat, surrounded. I mean, it's actually in the moat. I mean, they controlled the levels of the water for the lake and the moats and everything. And this island is just absolutely flat, nothing but grass, because that was where they put their sheep.
Mhm.
And the only way to get to it is a bridge from the inside of the castle. So, you know, they had to supply food and water, and too many fantasy writers don't think about any of this.
Well, you don't necessarily have to put all that into your book either, but at the
No,
same
but
time, if you ignore it, sometimes if you're reading it, you start thinking, well, wait a minute, how did they do this? You know, so you need to at least
right.
make a sentence or two. Sometimes it's all you need.
Oh yeah. I mean, with the Earthshar stories, I don't go into a whole lot of detail except that I always mention that from the city walls you have a view of farms. You know, not just empty countryside. It's always farms because you need to grow all that stuff.
Hmm.
Um,
I think too many authors also, when they create a world, actually, I'm getting a little ahead of what I was going to talk about, but I just want to bring it up before we forget, is that they create all the world and then they think that they have to put it into their story.
yeah, that's before we started this chat. You mentioned reading Lord Fowl's Bane by Stephen Donaldson, and I remember I picked that up in the store when it was new, and I looked in the front, and there was a map, and I looked at the map, and I said, "Oh, there's one of everything. There's one forest and one central castle and one rocky coast and one sandy coast, and I'm willing to bet that the protagonist is going to visit each of them." And that they also, I noticed they all fit in a rectangle so that they'll fit on one page of a book. And I was right. You know, Covenant does go to each of those places along there. Um, and this is bad world building, in my opinion. I mean, it's not really what Donaldson was interested in, so he didn't worry about it. But I found it very annoying when I read that book, which was about 45 years ago now.
Yeah, same here. I think what I was referring to mostly, although I certainly don't disagree with what you just said, are writers who create backgrounds for their characters and the lands, and then they have to put it in there. They think, well, I spent all this time,
Oh yeah.
I'm going to put it in as a prologue, or I'm just going to make sure that one of the characters spends 3 pages
Oh yeah.
describing
Well,
the
people
world.
do this not just about the map. They also, I mean, when you have a historical novel, it's like, I did all this research and you're going to see it.
Right.
It's the same thing. It's just research instead of world building. It's taking something that was already built and showing how much you know about it. Um, yeah, I have often wound up, dealing with would-be young writers, and they'll ask me to read their stuff, and mostly I say no, but every so often I will weaken and I will look at some of it. And a really common mistake is to decide, well, first I have to explain the background. I have to explain why character A needs to get to place B to get thing C, and why character A is the only one who can do this because they are the great 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 grandchild of the person who put thing C there. And then here's the royal family tree, so that you can see how they're the rightful heir and their evil uncle that shouldn't be on the throne. And they will put all this in a prologue.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is background, and we don't need to know this for chapters. And when we do need to know it, you should throw it in with just like one line of dialogue.
Yes.
There's no way you need that prologue. There's no way that you want to shove that in the reader's face. It's just the most important thing in writing anything is to not bore the reader. I mean, that's the one key bit of writing advice. Actually, there's two. The other one is finish what you write, because nobody buys unfinished stories. Um, but don't be boring is the key to successful writing.
I think the key is if you
And
have a good world filled out in the back of your mind, you know it. And so as you're writing the dialogue, suddenly the characters will start referencing it. You don't need to think, I'm going to put
right,
this information. It
exactly.
just comes out naturally.
The reader will pick it up. I mean, with Ethshar, I know everything about Ethshar. I've been working on it since I was in ninth grade, so
Mhm.
which was 1969. So it's been a long time, and I know everything there is to know about Ethshar, most of which readers don't know. There's a huge amount of background that I've never put in the stories, and I'm not going to, because it's not stuff the characters know. It's stuff I know, but they don't. And you know, I I have readers constantly telling me, well, not constantly, but frequently telling me that I love Ethshar because it just feels so real and detailed. And that's because I know all this stuff I haven't told you. And if I
Mhm.
told you, it would be a whole lot less interesting.
Let's talk about some of the other things that need to be concerned. We talked a little bit about uh, the economics in terms of, you can't have a castle without farms and things nearby it.
Right.
What are some of the
And
other?
you need to have a monetary system.
Mhm.
I mean, even if people mostly use barter, there's going to be money somewhere. There always has been. I don't think anyone really has figured out how to run a complex civilization without money. Um, you need to have, yeah, you need to know where. Oh, okay. If you're going to do a fantasy world, is there magic? And if so, how much of it? How powerful is it? What does it cost? Can everybody do it, or only some people? Is it hereditary? I mean, who can get to do magic and who doesn't? I mean, is it you get magic if you go on a quest and to this faraway place? And if so, why hasn't some clever entrepreneur streamlined the whole process? So you just sign up and they take you up there on a bus, and there you get your magic. You have to think these things through. You can't just say, yes, this guy can work miracles and this guy can't, and I don't have a reason. That's just how it is. This does not make for good storytelling. You
Well,
have to
and
have,
also when we're talking about magic, one of the things that frustrates me is writers who will uh, not really explain how the magic works, but it always works exactly how the character needs it when they need it. Um,
yeah, that's bad writing.
yeah.
Um, right. I long time ago for Starlog of all things, I wrote an article on the laws of magic, and one of them is if magic is cheap. Well, okay, that's actually not one of the laws. It's one of the corollaries. Anyway, if magic is everywhere and it's cheap and easy, then people will use it all the time, and you have to try and imagine a society where everything is done by magic. So you can't have powerful, cheap, easy magic, because then you just wind up with a society that is so alien we can't imagine it. You have to have limits. There has to be a cost for the magic. It doesn't have to be a lot. Um, Orson Scott Card used to do a presentation at conventions on 500 story ideas in an hour. And one of them was talking about costs of magic. And it's like, okay, anyone can do magic, but every time you work a spell, you lose a finger. Well, you can only use magic 10 times in your life. You know, that was just, he was just throwing ideas out there, and that was one of them. It's like, that's interesting. And then he suggested a variant, but it doesn't have to be your own finger, which means that you're going to have magicians who are evil, basically. You know, you can't have, the only way you can have a good magician is if they only use volunteers, which means you'll only be able to use magic for really, really important things. Anyway, so, you know, there's hundreds of ways you can deal with this, but you need to work it out in advance. You need to have rules. You can't just, well, you can actually, getting back to Stephen Donaldson. And basically, the Covenant's magic and the White Gold Ring in the first trilogy, I didn't read the others. All he knows about it is it's incredibly powerful. He doesn't know how to use it until finally he just believes in it, and it can do anything at the end, pretty much. And you know, it can do anything, which is why he doesn't use it for the first 2.5 books. And I don't think that, I mean, obviously it worked. I mean, Donaldson sold millions of copies of those books, but it violates what I think of as good storytelling rules.
Yeah, by the time you get the third book, you're already hooked, though. That's the problem, you know.
Yeah,
So you
I
got to
think
finish
so.
it right in.
Although, even after the first book, I found myself thinking, why are the other characters putting up with this guy and not just beating him over the head and saying, use your damn magic?
He was the most unlikable hero we've had in quite a while, I thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, now we talked about economy. We talked about the magic system. Definitely, you have to have some magic rules, and it has to work. And you can't just surprise somebody at the very end going, "Oh, by the way, I can do this magic." You have to at least set it up, you know,
Right.
so it doesn't come as a surprise.
Right. I mean, if the magic only works at night, you cannot have, well, you can have an eclipse maybe, but you can't just have somebody who suddenly can do magic at noon because they wish hard enough, you know.
Yes, because it helps the plot move along. Let's talk about religion as well, which would work in any type of story. Or any sort of, I guess I'd say not just religion, but mythology, culture, those kind of
Right.
beliefs system.
Okay, let me mention that I majored in comparative religion in college. So this is something I've got a lot of opinions about.
Okay.
Um, an awful lot. Okay, you don't need anything in the way of organized religion. There have been lots of Asian societies where religion was just kind of a family thing. I've seen it argued that, in fact, for most of the existence of the Roman Empire, the nobody really believed in the Olympian gods. They were just sort of figureheads for the state. But people did believe in the Lares and Penates of their own family, their own household. Those were important. Those you took care of, those you believed in. They were what really mattered. And you know, you might say a prayer to Zeus or Jupiter, just, you know, pro forma, but you didn't actually expect Jupiter to have anything to do with you. Whereas the spirits of your ancestors, they were present. They were part of your life. And you know, that's actually how a lot of religions have operated. I mean, Taoism and okay, Taoism isn't the right term. That's what they call it. In China, a lot of people just have their own individual beliefs, and which sometimes amount to ancestor worship, and Westerners don't really understand how this works. But you know, they didn't have organized worship services that you went to. You know, it was on a very scattered, unorganized kind of level. I mean, you'd have a temple, but most people didn't go there very often, and it wasn't. It wasn't usually to worship, it was to ask for something. In Shanghai, there is a temple, the temple of the city god of Shanghai, which they reopened about 30 years ago now, after having closed it during the revolution. And I've been there, and there are services, and you will see people come in and out during the services and totally ignore the priests who are up there going through this elaborate ritual. It's just not what they're concerned with. What they're there for is they'll buy prayers done in calligraphy, which they then burn as a sacrifice to the city god. Or they will come in just and buy a bunch of incense and burn it over the altar. And to ask for something, they're asking for favors. And that it's not a matter of, the gods need to be worshipped. It's the gods can help you. It's a very different approach from the Western, Christian idea of, God is everywhere and you have to keep him happy.
So if I can just cut to
I'm
how that
going off
works
on
with,
a tangent.
I know you could talk about this for hours. So I'm trying to say, as far as your world building, if you're creating a world, even in the real world, you have to also consider religion, don't you believe?
Yes.
Mhm.
People, yeah, people have their beliefs, which may or may not correspond with reality. However, in a fantasy world, if you have a fantasy world where the gods actually manifest themselves,
Mhm.
that kind of changes things. It's very hard to be an atheist when the gods appear in the heavens and say, "All right, do this."
Mhm.
This is Terry Pratchett had fun with this in the Discworld series,
Yes.
where he had atheists who the gods had a tendency to, the gods had a tendency to not like being disbelieved in, and at one point he describes something incredibly reckless as being like standing on a hill in copper armor, holding up a sword and saying all gods are bastards,
What do you think
because
of
you
like
just know one of them is going to hit you with lightning if you try it. I mean, in the Discworld, they're
they
the
would?
gods are there. They live in done manifesting. So,
What do you think of like the Star Trek idea where there's hardly ever any mention of religion, as if we've all evolved past religion, at least in most Star Trek, not in all of them. I mean, Deep Space Nine had some religion
well,
in it. Is
yes.
that just ignoring it? Is that bad? Or do you think people will still be believing,
I don't
2400?
know. Okay, I, where I
But
grew up was a classy bedroom suburb in Massachusetts, or fairly classy, where the local industry was most of the population was the families of engineers. We were the hometown for Raytheon and MITRE and a few other high-tech corporations. And there were churches, but hardly anyone actually took them very seriously except as social institutions. People who were actually serious believers, they were there, but they were very quiet about it. It was just, I mean, it was considered kind of rude to discuss religion in public. So I can imagine a society where you've got an entire civilization like that, and I think that was. I mean, Roddenberry himself was an atheist and assumed that eventually the civilization that produced the Federation would reach his level of enlightenment. I don't think that's realistic. I don't. I think there are always going to be people who feel the need for some sort of comforting mythology, and I suspect what form it takes is going to change. When you try and impose atheism on a culture on any culture, it usually doesn't work. I mean, the communists tried that and it never stuck.
yeah,
Um, I mean, in Russia, people were still Orthodox. It's just it wasn't state approved anymore, but they still went to church. They still prayed, and in North Korea, they replaced any previous religion with worship of the Kim family, which I don't think is an improvement, but it's a religion. And in
hmm
China, they realized it wasn't going to work fairly quickly, so they just said, okay, you can have religions as long as they don't get in our way as the authority behind everything. So, and especially after Mao's death and after the Gang of Four was thrown out, they loosened up considerably. So if you go to China now, you'll find the temples like the city god of Shanghai. And incidentally, his name is Shanghai. I mean, you know, when I call, they just, he's the spirit of the city. And he's not in any official pantheon, but he has a temple and people go there and believe in it. So, and then
What
you can buy idols in the department stores, and they will have Kuan Yin and all the ancient Chinese gods, and they will have Buddha, several different Buddhas, and that you can also get an idol of Chairman Mao that you can take
so
home and make sacrifices of fruit, coins, and incense to.
so you think that any fiction that we write should acknowledge at least some sort of belief system, and if you
Right.
ignore that, you're sort of ignoring what humanity
You're
or
you're
yeah,
ignoring human nature.
yeah.
Yes. But it doesn't have to be very explicit at all. I mean, it does. Most religions, most cultures are not theocratic. They have a religion or multiple religions, but it's not considered anyone's business except for the believers.
And that applies to science fiction as well. You see less religion
I
in
think so.
science fiction than you do in fantasy.
Yeah.
Um, and you think it's because of the Star Trek idea that, the future we don't,
I don't know that it's. I mean, Star Trek didn't originate that.
right.
A lot of early science fiction just sort of ignored the whole thing because they didn't want to explicitly endorse any one religion, because that's cutting into their market. Occasionally, you get things that were specific. I mean, Blish wrote specifically Catholic science fiction on a few occasions, and so did. No, I'm drawing a blank. Let's just stick with Blish.
Okay.
Um, and you can do that, but most science fiction writers prefer not to think about that. They wanted to just stick to the technological and scientific adventures, which makes sense.
Let's talk. I'm a lawyer, so of course I think of the law as well and government. Too often, uh, people who create worlds for their stories will ignore government completely and the laws completely unless they actually need it. Whereas it's always in the background there, if nothing else,
Yeah,
police and guards and things like that. But the
right.
thing that I find frustrating is when the implication is that everyone agrees. You got a king and everyone loves the king and there's nobody who objects to the king or whatever, and that's. Do you find that as a problem, or when you think?
It's a potential
Let me
problem.
let me do it broader. When you're creating your world, how much do you think about those kind of issues, government and laws and stuff, or only when you need to?
I have to admit, for me, it's usually only when I need to. Um, but I try to not be. I try not to ignore it completely. I mean, if I have an absolute monarchy somewhere, there's going to be people who aren't happy about it, and I don't take for granted that the best system is hereditary monarchy, because and in the Earthshar series, there's the small kingdoms that are off to the east of Earthshar itself, and I point out that they're called kingdoms, but not all of them are. There's at least one that's a matriarchy, only women can rule. There's at least one that is run by a council of witches. Um, there's some with a council of elders and the king is a figurehead who can break ties in the council, but that's about it. So I try to provide some variety, and in several of these, for one thing, because they are very small, if you don't like your king, you can go somewhere else. So you do get people who just ignore the whole thing. So there's the areas outside the main centers of civilization which are pretty lawless. And even so, I admit I should probably put more thought into it. Of course, I do have law enforcement mechanisms. I mean, in the cities of Earthshar, you have the city guards, and each one has a system of magistrates, each of whom is in charge of a specific district of the city, and then they answer to the overlord and his court. Um, but and then I don't know how many people ever noticed, but in Dragon Weather, the rulers are, I mean, it's plutocracy. you become a lord when you have employees. So it's if you run a company, you're a lord, and you have authority, and you are respected by other lords. And as I said, I don't know how many people read the novel and ever noticed that, but it's there. It's part of it's the underlying structure. And this actually dates back. You don't need the whole history. I'm sorry. It
Well,
dates
no, but
back
the
to the
thing is,
Man-Dragon Wars.
but this
I
goes
have
back
a
to what you
history.
were saying before, is that you don't have to put all the reasons in there. It's just you know how it works. You don't necessarily to
Right,
explain it to your readers how it works, and that's what makes the reading it when you're reading it. That's why you feel like it's real because no one's explaining it to you. I guess that's part of
right,
what I'm talking about with world building. You don't want to be lectured to. You just want to
right,
feel like you're part of this world. Um,
right.
what about other aspects that people sometimes forget when they're building a world of any kind of world?
Well, if I can cut over to science fiction for a moment,
Sure, absolutely.
one of the things when you are designing an alien planet, you have to consider stuff that you don't think about in fantasy because you just take it for granted that it's all the same as Earth. But you have how much sunlight is there? How long is the day? How powerful is the gravity? How long is the year? Um, these are all things that you need to consider when you're setting stuff on an alien planet, and too many writers don't. They just say, "Oh, it's a 24-hour day, or it's 25 hours," and you have sun that's a little brighter than on Earth, or a little redder, or whatever. But it would actually make a huge difference. And also, do you have native life forms that are interacting with the imported ones? Um, in I'm trying to figure out okay, in Nightside City, the um, the planet in question, they thought it was tide locked, so that there was just a day side and a night side, and they weren't ever going to change. And they discovered it actually was still oscillating a bit. So it has a day that's about 160 years long. And its orbit is about, I think it was 405 days, something like that. But its day is 160 Earth years. So that results in some pretty complicated situations. And then
That would
and then
also,
the hmm?
I was going to say, you also have to take into consideration aliens too, because what
Oh
kind
yeah,
of local creatures would grow up in a place if the gravity was much stronger? Would they be short and squat, like
oh yeah. Hal
like,
Clement was the best at that.
yeah.
Yeah. And although I've been recently watching the TV series The Expanse, and one of the things that they get right is that the Belters are tall and thin with brittle bones because they've grown up in a very low gravity environment. And I love the fact that they included that it's a plot point that they actually took the trouble to. I don't know how they got some of these people to look the way they did. Probably CGI, but I was very impressed with how they handled that in that series. I mean that's
Um,
a series with some very good world building.
when you're creating a fantasy world too, especially nowadays, actually science fiction too, I should mention. If you read old fantasy and old science fiction from like the 60s and the 50s below that, it's all very male dominated, and quite
Yeah,
often, everyone is a white guy, and they don't take any, even though they're representing the entire earth, it's always English speaking white people who are in control of everything. And nowadays you really can't do that, even if you make your story take place in a fantasy world where that could be true. Do you find that to be true? Or do you think
uh,
people will be upset with
okay.
that if you try to make it realistic?
I don't know.
Realistic,
I
you know
mean,
what I mean?
to
Realistic
be
question mark.
honest, a lot of people don't notice. They just, they'll take for granted as the default that they'll assume it's all white people. Um, in Earthshar, though, right from the start, blondes are like one person in a million. They're not all white people. Everyone's got black hair. I mean, the skin color varies, but almost everyone has black hair. Redheads and blondes exist, but they're incredibly scarce. It's a major plot point when I had a blonde character turn up in Taking Flight, and that's because they're not white. Everyone
Mhm.
assumes, well, they must be white, and I just never said, but I've always known that they weren't. They're brown skinned and black haired,
Mhm.
and mostly, but there's some variety. So every so often you'll get the right combination of genes, and you get a blonde or a redhead.
I guess my
fail
point
safe.
is when you're creating your world, you need to think about that as well.
Yeah, you do. You do need to
Because
think
too
about
often people just don't even, you know what they are. You don't necessarily have to put it in your writing, of course, but
it. Right.
you have at least thought it out in your world building, what they're like and what they act like.
Right. And remember, I said I know way more about F-Sharp than I've ever told anybody. That's one thing I never explicitly mentioned. I mean, when I mention that, I'll mention that just black hair, and I hardly ever mention any other hair color. And people seem to not pay any attention to that, and I don't know, or maybe they do, and I'm just underestimating my readers. I don't know. And
In Game of Thrones series, more in the TV show than the books, um,
mhm,
it's a very male-dominated society, which
right,
is you would expect in a fantasy world based on traditional Earth. But at the same time, by the end of the book, the three most powerful people are the women. So he's sort
mhm.
of taken that and turn it on his head a little bit.
Well, in
So
a
he
society
obviously,
where you have magic, which is one sex better at magic, because that can really throw the balance off. I mean, in the Death Star series, I keep using that as an example because it's what I know better than anything else.
Mhm.
I've got extremely powerful women because they are extremely powerful wizards. And if you're the most powerful wizard in town, nobody cares if you're male or female. You're still
Right.
scary.
Yes,
Um,
do not piss off the wizards. Yes.
right. In my very actually this in my very first novel, The Lure of the Basilisk, my hero isn't human at all. He's got leathery brown skin and no nose, and which was fun. And most of the people he encounters, I don't really describe very much. But there is one character, Shang, who is this wizard who has wiped out an entire city and made it his own personal stronghold. Um, and he's explicitly black. He's the only character in the book, other than the Overman, who has a specified color. And when I originally wrote that, the one editorial change that Lester Del Rey, actually there was more than one, but one of the editorial changes Lester Del Rey wanted was that I could not say that he had kinky hair, because that would be taken as racist. So I think I made him bald instead. I forget. Maybe I just didn't mention his hair. Um, but I thought that was kind of weird that, you know, didn't matter that he was black, but I couldn't refer to his hair as being
Okay.
a natural hair for a black guy.
Let me ask you about fantasy and magic, because sometimes some people have said because there's magic, it slows down technology, and it
It might.
sometimes one thing that bothers me in some fantasy novels is that 1,000 years will go by and
Oh,
there's been no progression in technology whatsoever in that 1,000 years. They're still living in castles
yeah.
and using outhouses or whatever.
Yeah. I once pointed out that if Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the
Mhm.
King, right? If you look at a comparable monarchy in our world, let's say the English throne, this is not equivalent to putting the Stuart claimant back on the throne. He was only a couple of 100 years ago. This is equivalent to putting, it's not even Alfred the Great's heirs. This is putting some Roman dude or some pre-Roman druid who comes along and claims to be the rightful heir to the throne. And everyone says, oh, of course, and agrees and puts him back in power. And it's like things, it's the kings of Gondor have been gone for literally thousands of years. And it's like, that's ridiculous. This is not how things work. I mean, you go more than a couple of lifetimes and nobody's going to recognize any hereditary authority
Did you ever
further
see
back.
the animated series Avatar: The Last Airbender? Not the movie, but the
No,
TV
no, I
series.
have not. I have not. I have heard about it, but I've never seen it.
I enjoyed it very much. And then they did a sequel that takes place like 100 years later, or 50, 70 years later, and it's a fantasy story. And then the sequel, there's like all kind of steampunk inventions and things, and zeppelins and things. And some of the people are going, "Well, that's ridiculous." And the writer said, "No, it's been 100 years. Of course, technology is going to change, even though there's magic in the
Yeah.
world." And I
Have you
thought,
ever
great. I wish more writers would think like that.
have you ever read the Leovac series?
No.
Okay, it was a shared world back in the 80s. Um, the core group.
I know of it, but I have never read it. No.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
In that, the one of the big events that happens as the series go on is the development of railroads. I mean, they still have magic everywhere, but magic doesn't get cargo moved from one city to the next, and railroads do.
Mm-hmm.
And Terry Pratchett in Discworld, a lot of the Discworld stories are about some invention that comes along and messes things up, like the printing press,
Mm-hmm.
the clacks, which are sort of a cross between telegraph. I mean,
Postman. Yes.
it's semaphores, but highly advanced to a level they never actually reached in the real world because we had better systems by then.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's got trains too, railroads.
Yeah.
So this is something that some writers think about, and far too many don't, and that they'll just have things drag on forever without any change. Now, in my own work, I generally try to have some change, but I don't want to have an all-out industrial revolution because a lot of people wouldn't want that in their fantasy. So.
Yeah. Well, in your steampunk, series, obviously you're.
Tom Derringer?
Yeah, you're using an alternate history because there's technology that exists, but may not have existed at the time the story took place. How far are you willing to stretch that?
Well, okay, Tom Derringer is weird because I obsessively research those and make them as accurate as possible, which I really shouldn't do. Because you've got things where you've got the lost city of the Mirage, which appears and disappears at random all around the world. And you've got the lizard people living in tunnels under Los Angeles. But on the other hand, the Panic of 1884 takes place exactly the same way it did in our world.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mayan rebels in southern Mexico are exactly at Chan Santa Cruz are exactly the same as they were in our world. So,
but that's part of the fun of a steampunk novel, in my opinion. I mean, my steampunk novel, I did the same thing. I found real history and made it tie into the story.
oh yeah,
And to me, I think it just makes it so much more fun.
I cheated a little bit because I realized I got some of the dates wrong. The first one, the aluminum airship,
Mm-hmm.
the villain has obtained several tons of aluminum, which enables him to do technological stuff that no one else on Earth can do.
Right.
And then at the end, it's like having this supply of aluminum could mess things up, and it doesn't, because I say the smelting of aluminum was developed right about then. Except actually, I cheated. It was like 2.5 years off, because the real development of the electric smelter. The real development of the electric smelter just didn't fall when I needed it historically, so I cheated.
As someone who's read that novel, I never noticed.
Well, now you know.
Yeah. Okay, Kevin Morley had a question, and I think it's a good one. You mentioned religion and connected it to your past revelations, and that it seemed more of a social contract or a club. Can that not be true of many things? You expanded upon family ancestry as a form of worship, but that could be attributed to largest things like military camaraderie and Klingon religion based on a warrior caste, those kind of things. So basically, when you say religion, we don't just mean beliefs in a god, are we? We're talking about, right, okay.
Right. And there are all kinds of ways to structure a society. If you want an example of bad world building, in my opinion,
sure.
And
that'll
much
help.
as I love Babylon 5, the Minbari civilization makes no fucking sense at all. I mean, seriously. The military caste, the religious caste, and the worker caste, and that's the entire population. And it's just like, why would they put up with that? That's just not a stable way to build a civilization, and they have it lasting for centuries unchanged.
Well, if they explained it by saying, I don't know, something about how they're an alien race and they might think completely different than we do, but they've never actually said that in the show, they never actually.
Well, and they remember their souls, and human souls and Minbari souls are the same thing.
That's true. And that's allowed to lend to change too. Yes. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So we're running out of time. So do you have any other final comments you think you want to make about world building that I haven't asked you yet that we should talk about? We haven't talked about language, for instance, how language changes over thousands of years.
You always assume in a fantasy novel that what you're getting is a translation. I mean, Tolkien the granddaddy of us all basically said that this is his translation of the Red Book of Westmarch. And that's something that, okay, if you're making a pun in English, you really need to think about whether it's worth it. I mean, I've done it, but
Yeah.
you need to think about whether it's a good idea, whether it would be the same pun for the people that you're writing about. I have actually constructed the languages of several of my fantasy worlds so as to, avoid that sort of mistake. I have great fun making up my own proverbs, for example. Instead of the straw that broke the camel's back, it's the pebble that sank the barge, things like that.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because world building means that there would be, the language from today. If someone from 50 years ago came to today, they wouldn't understand half of what we're saying.
oh
Not
yeah,
just because of technological, but idioms, and analysis and relationships. Language changes over times, and sometimes
oh
writers
yeah.
forget about that.
When I was a kid, I read a bunch of my parents' books from the 1920s, which I assume had been their parents' books because they were kids in the 1920s. But we had a bunch of books from the 1920s, and I read them, and some of them I found very hard to follow, and I assumed it's just because it was advanced vocabulary that I hadn't learned yet. And then when I grew up and read more, I realized that no, what the problem was is this is 1920s slang,
Mhm.
you know, and I'm so Peter Wimsey was the most extreme example where he would be making all these what I thought were esoteric references, and they were actually just you know catchphrases from the 1920s.
Mhm.
And but a lot of them I had no idea what he's talking about because I didn't know the catchphrase in question. And I was assuming it was some obscure literary reference. And no, it was 1920s pop culture.
And I think
And
that's
yeah,
no, I think it's a good thing to take into consideration. I wrote a story that takes place like 50 years from now, and I threw in a whole bunch of really strange statements that they made. And I remember my editor saying, "What does this mean?" I went, "I'm not sure. It's slang from the future, And they
right.
just said it, and it means something to them, so that's important." And I thought that helped make the story feel more different and, in a different time.
Well, I've you have just recently bought a story from me about time travelers in the
Yes.
late 21st century, where they need to give the one from the 1790s a translator, an
Hmm.
interpreter, because otherwise she can't tell what the hell people are talking about. I mean, the word scientist wasn't coined until 20 years after she died. So,
That's right. And that's what I like. That makes it much more believable and realistic. And sometimes authors forget about that kind of thing too. When you're world building, you have to think about all kind of stuff like that.
they say, we're going to provide an interpreter for you.
Mhm.
And she's pleased by that. And they say, we'll install it at once. You'll what?
Stall. Yes.
Install? Yeah. I mean, you've read the story. You're the only person who
Yeah, of
has,
course.
so you know what I'm
Yes.
talking about.
And just for those of you who are watching, it's from a new book called Three Time Travelers Walk into ... with a bunch of good stories. It's not out yet as of this recording.
Right.
Um, but look for it soon. Uh, all right. Well, just in summary, I guess the point is everyone needs to do world building, no matter what kind of story, even if you're in a permanent, even if you're doing a story that takes place in the permanent day to day.
Mhm.
Stephen King creates worlds in small towns in Maine. He knows what kind of culture is there. He knows what the rumors are. He knows what people are saying. He's got it
Right.
all worked out, and so don't think that world building is just about science fiction or fantasy, even though that's mostly what we've been talking about today.
Although, yeah, I wanted to, one more thing about science fiction world building
Hmm.
is generally you have to figure out, you take an environment that is not Earth, that's different. You have to figure out how people would adapt to fit that. For example, I've done stories set on planets with like an 18-hour day, where human beings can't function on an 18-hour daily cycle. So you have to figure out how would you schedule around that. So you'd have like first light, first sleep, second light, second sleep, and it would work out to 4 of our days would equal 6 of those. but that would be like one cycle. And anyway, other things like that. You have to work out how people would adapt normal human civilization to this alien environment. So that's in magical settings, you don't need to do that because you can just make it whatever you want. Anyway,
But the thing is, just by doing little things like that, that's not the plot of the story, but it adds so
no,
much to the story that makes it so much more believable, and you feel like you're part of it just by adding little details like that.
I suspect that many readers never even pick up on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
I
All
always
right.
try to make it work, but
In any event, thank you very much. We're running out of time. Lawrence, where can they find you if they want to look you up? What's your webpage?
wattevans.com. That's hyphenated. WATT-Evans.com. And it's a big sprawling mess because I started in 1994 and I never take anything down.
Do you what's your next, what are you doing other than the steampunk series right now? Anything else?
I have just signed the contract, delivered the manuscript and signed the contract for the next Deathshire novel,
Oh, okay.
Charming Shara, unless we decide to change the title, but that's probably the title. It is a short novel. It's a spin-off from Stone Unturned, which was the last major Deathshire novel. In Stone Unturned, there's there's a statue that gets brought back to life after 30 years, someone who's been turned to stone and been an ornamental statue in somebody's front hall for 30 years, who gets brought back to life. And after I'd written that, even though she's not part of the main story in that novel, I found myself wondering, how did she get there and how does she deal with this? So Charming Shara is about her. It's about how she wound up getting turned to stone and how she wound up spending 30 years in somebody's front parlor, and what she did after she got rescued.
Well, we'll look forward to that, and also hope that you get the movie made. That'd be wonderful.
That would be wonderful. Oh, and
Make sure they give you a cameo. What? Sorry.
The next Tom Derringer novel, the fourth one, Tom Derringer and the Electrical Empire, is complete in second draft. I'm going to do one more draft and then send it to the editor and see what she thinks of it.
Excellent. All right. Well, hopefully you'll be back here on the East Coast sometime soon so we can meet again. And thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks.